Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. In the previous video, we looked at the recovery models, which determined whether we could do a transactional log backup of the transactional log file based on the database. In this video, we're going to look into a little more deeper inside a transactional log and see that activity that we've been talking about. There is a function called fn_dblog, which basically requires a LSN number, which is a log sequence number, and an ending log sequence number for a transaction. So all these transactions have a beginning and ending transaction number. But for our purposes, we're going to use just as a null as a starting and ending value. So the following demonstration that I will be showing you will illustrate to you how a transaction records multiple rows of data for any activity against the database, and how this transactional log backups truncates the transactional log file, and once it's written to the backup log. So we've been talking that in deeply in the previous videos, and now I'm going to demonstrate to you, and we're actually going to see that in action. So let's go to our database. So the first thing I'm going to do here, let's actually just look at my notes, probably going to reiterate what I just said. So the following example will show you how the transactional records multiple rows of data for any activity against the database, and how a transactional log backup truncates the log file once it's written to the log backup file. So I cleared that example also. So let's begin. So the first thing I'm going to do is, you see, I've already got this database. I'm going to drop it using this script here. So I'm just going to highlight this store procedure and drop the database so we can start from scratch. So now that's dropped, I'm going to first create a database. So I'm going to go use master. I'm going to change the master, which we should be when you create a database. And now that the database is created, we can just click here and go refresh. And there it is. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use that database, as you can see, use view log, and it'll change here. And in that database view log, I'm going to create a table called cities. And now I'm going to look at inside this function. This function is called fn_dblog with two null values. The null values represent the starting and ending points of the log sequence number, or LSN number, but in our case we're just going to use nulls. So we're just going to do a select count from that function. So if I highlight it and go execute, you'll see I get about 518 entries. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a full backup of the database. So I'm going to make sure I view it, or make sure I log onto it. And now notice one thing. So I'm going to take a full database backup. And now what I'm going to do is that into that table that I just created, I'm going to insert records. And I'm going to insert 1,000 records. And now that's done. So remember, all this activity is being recorded in the transactional log file. The creation of the database, the dropping of the database, the backing up the database, the insertion of these values into the cities table database. So there's a tremendous amount of activity going on in the database, and it's all being captured and modified in the transactional log file. And now we're going to look inside the log file and see how many activities is occurring. Remember, all we did was essentially we inserted 1,000 records, if you will. We did one transaction, if you will, of backing up the data, and we did one creating a table. So if we do a count now of the transactions that occurred, you'll see that this number is drastically increased from 3,070. So now what I'm going to do, just to illustrate, is I'm going to back up the database, just to illustrate that backing up the database does not truncate the transactional log. And that's the whole illustration of this video. That is that when you have a transactional log with a tremendous amount of activity, backing up, a full backup, does not truncate the logs. Right now it's 3070. So now I'm going to take a full database backup, and I'm going to look inside the function again, which is recording the activity of the transactional log. And you'll notice actually it's increased a little because I did the backup table. So backup of the database. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back up the transactional log file using this command backup log. So this will truncate the transactional log file by moving the committed transactions to the backup file. So now if I highlight this, and remember now, I just completed a full backup of the database view log, and nothing happened to the transaction log. It actually grew in numbers. And now I'm going to take a transaction log backup of the transaction log file and then see if the count in this function has reduced. So if I execute, and there we go. So we have a backup log successful. And now if I do a count of that function, which remember contains all the activities on the transaction log, and you'll notice it's reduced from 3070 to 20. So this clearly demonstrates that taking a transactional log backup of the transactional log file truncates or clears the inactive portion of the transactional log file, whereas a full database backup does not truncate the log. So if you want to manage the size of your truncation log file, then the best way to do it is have your recovery model in full, and then take periodic transactional log file backups, which truncates the log. And actually we can see now inside the transactional log, I didn't want to do it when it's 3070, but now we can look at it and we get an idea of what's going on. Now obviously at this point you don't want to pay attention to this, it's complex, but a few things. This is the current log sequence number, the begin and end portion, and so on. And then the transactional log file is something you want to pay attention to. But this is probably for another course. We don't want to get into it this deep. So this just illustrates that when there is activity against the database of any kind, of any modification, the transactional log file is recording that. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing until you take a transactional log backup of that file, not a full database backup, as it's misleading. So I'm going to leave it there. I think this clearly illustrates what I wanted to point out, and we'll pick it up in the next video. So my name is Raphael, and this is how to become a production SQL database administrator.